How did Christianity take over the vast Roman Empire in such a seemingly short amount of time? After all, the empire had stood for centuries in its adherence to the old gods, dominating the rest of its neighbors around the Mediterranean and showing no real issue when it came to clamping down on internal dissent. So how did Christianity do it? Why did it gain sway with the masses, when you already had a long history of established traditions, when there were already other henotheistic practices worshipping supreme deities, and when you already had other messianic cults promising eternal salvation in the afterlife? How did it withstand suppression, when other subversive cults like the Bacchanalians had faced swift dismantlement in 186 BC? When Jewish dissenters had their entire province set aflame in a series of revolts from 66 to 135 AD, and when the Manichaeists were so vigorously stamped out by numerous authorities of the 3rd and 4th centuries. And finally, what convinced the emperors to embrace it, when estimates indicate that just 3 to 10% of the overall population was Christian around the time of Constantine's conversion, and when pagan rulers like Julian attempted to return to the old ways, even as late as the 350s AD. These are questions I've long racked my brain over, and unfortunately, as I've dug to find answers, they've only revealed an ever-deepening chasm only dimly lit by facts, and plagued by a fog of mystery. But today, we're going to try and provide answers in 2 parts. First, by building a simplified bridge over the chasm with some overarching dates and hypotheses. Then second, we'll descend into the chasm to get a sense for the messy but fascinating nature of our topic. This is the journey to understand the rise of Christianity. Now, with complex topics like this, it can be very hard to mold things in a way that is efficient to do research and especially to present the information. And that's where today's sponsor, Miro, comes in. Miro is an infinitely scrolling whiteboard that I personally have found to be a goldmine for my own life, and especially for Invicta. We've been using it for the last couple years, and we've actually been integrating it into videos like this one. So let me show you kind of how it works. So as our first example, I wanted to show you our whiteboard that shows the rise of Christianity both as a research tool and a presentation tool that we'll be using today. And truly, it is an infinitely scrolling whiteboard. And then zooming in on the information, you can see that you can drop in maps. You can add comments, both in terms of text, which has all sorts of bullet formatting. If you wanted to link stuff, it's really easy. You can then drop in videos. It integrates with a bunch of other programs. And look how information dense this is. When I get down into this chart, it preserved all the details of this graphic. So, this is the minutia of the details on this board, and zooming back out, look how much I have. And again, you can invite in a bunch of different users simultaneously, have them zooming around, contributing live at the same time. It's really great for remote teams. And speaking of that, we have some other boards that I wanted to show you. For instance, on our team internally, we have like a planning board that we use. So this is from a couple cycles ago, but it shows here, we were looking month to month, different series, how we wanted to plan them. I can slide them around. I can change the color in this case if it was active or complete or delayed. So very good for planning. So we'd have a dedicated board to that. We have another board which might be used for like ideation and coming up with how you want to create things. And Miro has been developing a lot of times to capture all sorts of different workflows. So if you go here, for instance, on the Miroverse, you can see that they have a bunch of different use cases for different roles that you might fit into, different use cases. So if you're diagramming, doing research, team building, brainstorming, they have all kinds of demos and templates that you can pull up to start using them immediately. And then in addition to that, Miro is pushing integration with Confluence platforms. So like Jira, there can be interactions here for Kanban style workflows. It's all really great, and I can't recommend it enough. So if you think this is a useful tool to yourself, please consider using the link in the description to get started, as we get part of the commission for trying out the program. Anyways, hope you enjoy, and we'll see you in the video. So let's get started with the first part of our video, the high-level stuff. To find answers, we can start by first conceptualizing 2 periods of history, pagan Rome and Christian Rome. Between them lies a vast chasm which we shall attempt to cross the easy way by throwing some key dates on there to bridge the divide. From 27 to 30 AD, Jesus performs his ministries. Around 30 AD, Jesus is crucified. In the ensuing decades, his disciples spread the word. In 64 AD, Nero blames the nascent cult for the fire of Rome. In 70 AD, Jerusalem is destroyed, contributing to a growing Jewish diaspora which facilitates Christianity's dispersal. By the end of the 1st century, the Gospels are written, and in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christianity gradually spreads across major urban centers, with many branching versions of the faith being practiced as it adapts to local areas and populations. In response, there's friction with the existing status quo. Persecutions ramp up, though still discontinuous and with varying severity, resulting in increasing cases of martyrdom whose stories further fuel awareness and conversions. By the end of the 3rd century, Christianity appears to have reached around 3 to even 10% of the population, though figures are very rough. In 311 AD, Emperor Galerius passes the Edict of Toleration, abating prior persecutions and effectively legalizing Christianity in the Eastern Empire. In 312 AD, Emperor Constantine embraces Christianity, his mother's religion and that of some of his advisors, following his own victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. In 313 AD, the Edict of Milan grants Christianity legal status, officially ending persecutions. And in 325 AD, the First Council of Nicaea kicks off centralized efforts to finally attain consensus in the Church under the watchful eye of the Emperor. In 337 AD, Emperor Constantine dies, with his son succeeding him to the throne, and continuing the crucial tradition of the imperial family taking up the faith. In the ensuing decades, Christianity reaches a critical mass, especially among key demographics, allowing it to more rapidly grow, and in particular to take advantage of social and political levers of power key to gaining dominance. In 380 AD, Theodosius I, Emperor of the East, and Gratian, Emperor of the West, issue the Edict of Thessalonica, which establishes Nicene Christianity as the official state religion. Thus, by the ensuing 5th century, Christianity has become firmly established as the dominant religion of the Roman world. Thereafter, it'll face continued fracturing, competition with other religions, but for now, that's our general trend. Thus, with these dates, we've provided a surface-level understanding of how Christianity spread over the course of several centuries, a time frame which starts to better contextualize claims of a quick rise. But even so, we're still left with the frustrating lack of the whys. Why did it happen this way? This question has drawn the interest of many scholars, whose answers run the gauntlet from an inevitable triumph of the one true faith to the random outcome of an entirely unforeseeable series of chaotic events. Neither of these is very convincing, and the truth likely falls somewhere in between. We can review a couple posited ideas. One answer, circulated mostly among Christians, points to the testimony of the martyrs, the idea being that the truth of the faith is attested to by the willingness of its followers, and especially the original apostles, to die for their beliefs. Such tales had even greater relevance in the face of mounting persecution and served as strong conversion tools. Even after the state-sponsored persecutions ended, further church mythologizing only helped to strengthen this tool, to the point that even today, many Christians find such arguments compelling in their conversions to and perseverance in the faith. Other ideas take more secular approaches to their framing, by looking at the socio-economic appeal of Christian messaging. One answer, for instance, touts the unique carrot-and-stick nature of Christian brand salvation. The idea here is that, in contrast to many of its contemporaries, Christianity had the carrot of offering up a real paradise to be gained in the afterlife, while simultaneously threatening the stick of damnation to those who refused. On top of this, you also have the ideas that the premise of monotheism itself tended to mean that once the barrier to conversion was crossed, it was more or less one way, with no more shopping around with the gods of a wider pantheon, at least in theory. Another answer posits that Christianity's egalitarian worldview was particularly appealing to the marginalized members of society, such as the lower classes, women, and slaves, in a world with no shortage of poverty, particularly in increasingly stratified urban environments. On the flip side, another answer reminds us that while Christianity certainly appealed to the downtrodden, it was not radical enough in practice that the middle and upper classes were excluded. After all, their embrace would be key to breaking into the mainstream. This idea goes hand in hand with answers pointing to the key Christian tenet of inclusive proselytization, which helped propel it forward and bring in non-believers of all stripes, a feature which should be contrasted with its roots in more insular Judaism, and a self-sustaining feature whose advantages are quite evident when we consider the impact of missionary work even in our own world today. Others might point to the strength of Christian communities themselves as strong foundations for growth in the face of an increasingly decentralized and destabilized world of the later Roman Empire. Some answers you might find push this idea even further, stressing that a lot of the era's major trends and forces just so happened to cause the perfect storm for the rise of Christianity, but which may have gone to another victorious religion had things played out a bit different. We could go on and on. There are many more potential answers out there. All of these certainly help offer hypotheses for why the Roman Empire may have gone from pagan to Christian. But there is still one glaring weakness to our understanding of this topic. the uncomfortable chasm of uncertainty which exists between the two states, the transition. Start asking more questions about the bridge we just built, and your digging reveals an ever-deepening hole in search for the bedrock of history. It's a seemingly endless pit, only dimly lit by sparse instances of concrete evidence. What's that? A Christian offering to Poseidon? Is this a Buddha Jesus? Is that an angel-themed curse tablet? Is this a circus or a basilica? It's all very muddled, messy history. At a certain point, we have to pull back from the pit and acknowledge that any answer we might come up with to explain why things happened will be a gross oversimplification of the details we might find in the pit. History is rarely so clear-cut, despite our insistence in trying to neatly categorize things. So today, we've brought on a special guest to serve as a guide for the journey down into the pit of uncertainty. This takes us to part 2. I hope you enjoy. Hey everyone, welcome to our long-form podcast interview where we're going to be discussing the rise of Christianity with respect to taking over the Roman Empire. And I'm going to be joined here by an expert, Kimball, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Kimball. I'm a Roman historian. I work mainly in cultural history, intellectual history, and in particular the history of religion, which is what I'm going to be talking with you guys about today. Very excited.
Yeah, and I'm going to lay things out just super high level where we're going with this in 3 separate categories. The first is going to be the religious marketplace. Basically, what is the environment in which Christianity is emerging? What are the different ideas it's competing with? And maybe what competitive advantages does it have in that religious marketplace to allow it to grow and expand? And then when it comes to the expansion itself, we're going to be looking at things from the bottoms up and the top down. Bottoms up is going to be Christianity on the local level. What does it look like for the individual to adopt Christianity? How does it evolve in terms of material culture, the ways people practice it, different heresies, so to speak, or different subcults and all that? What is like the granularity of how it evolves on the day-to-day? And then we'll be flipping that and looking at it from the top down, which is, okay, how does it interact with institutions, governments, official edicts? And so that overall is going to be our intro. Again, feel free to jump ahead with the timestamps. Otherwise, let's go ahead and dive into it. Cool. So let's get started with the religious marketplace here. So we're looking roughly at the Mediterranean world. A couple things I wanted to note here is we've just, tacked on a couple icons to represent some variety of religions. If we had a magic wand to wave to represent all of them, I think you would no longer see the shores of the Mediterranean or any topography here. There's so many different religions, especially if you allow this map to be updated with time. This would be just completely blanketed with different religions and variants. Even beyond that, there's influence from religions that are outside of this narrow framework. So that's the major thing, is that in this marketplace, it's super rich. And one little caveat that I would say is, even to this day, if you were to make this same map, you would have maybe a smaller, quote unquote, list of religions, but the ways in which it's practiced varies a lot from country to country, city to city, family to family. So that's the main thing as we head into this, is the marketplace is ever evolving and it's never quite uniform. There's always some sort of competition between beliefs and evolutions. So that's it at a high level. So Kimball, I'll let you kind of expound on that a little bit. And then I did want to tag on one thing in addition to just the different religions, which is some themes that we do see cropping up, which is like messianic prophecies that maybe aren't necessarily a religion, but are a theme that's kind of percolating into this mix as well. But I'll let you talk on this.
Yeah, so we want to talk about the ancient Mediterranean world as a religious marketplace, which is a concept that we get from economic theory, brought into the study of religion in order to look at the ways that people make decisions around what religions they practice and how they blend those traditions and beliefs. And in the ancient world in particular, it's important to think about, so you're looking for some kind of healing, right? So I need a healing cult. Are you going to go to a cult associated with your local spring? Are you going to go with a broader cult like Apollo Medicus that has a temple in your area? Are you making a pilgrimage to a different city for a healing cult there? You have all these options. And it's important to remember also that these options are not exclusive. You might do more than one of those things. But thinking about what different cults have to offer people is a helpful way to think about why they're making these decisions, that people aren't simply making irrational decisions about like, oh, I'm just going to go be Christian now, or I'm holding on to my pagan cult because I feel like it. Cults have something to offer. They give you healing or blessings of different kinds. They give you senses of community. They have services to offer. It's actually a common early Christian criticism of pagan cult is that everything is for sale. And so when we look at this religious marketplace, we can see that Christianity in its early days especially it's not alone in the world, and it's competing with all these other religious institutions and traditions that are trying to do similar things, or different things in some cases. And it is drawing from this sort of larger context in the ways that it creates its own traditions and practices, and in addition to how it stands out from those people. And sometimes it contrasts itself with those other practices. Yeah, so I think we're going to talk about messianic prophecy and then roll through some of what else is in the marketplace.
Yes, and this is a topic that I just personally wanted to tack on here because, like you said, you have these different religions that are offering things. Often religions are going to coincide with the interests of communities and politics and all that stuff. And so one thing that I had seen crop up, I think when we were covering the Mithridatic Wars, Mithridates latched on to this idea of he might be the Messiah, and he was aligning himself kind of in terms of propaganda with all these signs that he was going to be the savior of the East to overthrow the Romans and others. And he did that in a backdrop of a bunch of stuff kind of happening, I think primarily in the East, with the idea of anticipating a Messiah to help people, the end times and coming stuff. So you have this intersection of religion and politics and people who capitalize on it, but this general trend of kind of messianic prophecy is something that's also thrown in the mix of the marketplace that I just wanted to tack in there. And yeah, I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to add on that before we move on to looking at the marketplace.
Yeah, I mean, Christianity is definitely not the only religion that has these claims to messianic revelation, and we'll even talk about one, which is Manichaeism, a bit later. So it is definitely something that is percolating in the water at this time.
Cool. And then here we had the map, and then now what we've done is we've pulled out this kind of idea of what's in the marketplace. Again, the same idea stands. There's no way we could list all the different religions and cults and specifically what they're offering, but this is just to give you a sense of what's on the table. And then we've put some stars over the ones that we'll be kind of doing an aside on and talking in a bit more depth. But yeah, you want to kind of comment on the different flavors here?
Yeah. And again, the general disclaimer, this is by no means in any capacity exhaustive. We just wanted to pull out some of the major ones, and in particular, some that had some interesting parallels with Christianity. Right, so starting things out, we've got the cult of Isis, often joined with the cult of Serapis. Isis is an Egyptian deity that the cult gets brought to Rome fairly early, and becomes big. Isis is interesting in this regard because, similarly to Christianity, her followers often credited her with a universalism. She is the universal god. The sort of every other god is Isis in the end. And so we can see that Christianity is not the only one to sort of start this trend towards there's one god at the top, and that's the most important. Yeah. I don't think we're going to be doing quite as much on her today, although it is an interesting cult. Some of the others we've chosen to pull out, you can see Mithraism up next. Mithraism is a mystery cult around the god Mithras. And actually, as you can see from the two coins that have been pulled out there for Mithras and Sol Invictus on the right, you can actually see there is a relationship between those two. So not all of these are even discrete options. Both Mithraism and Sol Invictus actually are cults that spread with the Roman army, so they become popular through that, and we can see a lot of their popularity among soldiers makes them very visible in some ways in the archaeological record, which is fantastically fun. We'll be talking a little bit more about both of those later. Mithraism as a mystery cult, and Sol Invictus for its later connections with the emperors. Let's not forget Judaism in the top right, which needs a little bit less explanation because obviously Judaism continues to exist in the modern world. It existed already in the ancient Mediterranean and was fairly well established by the time our history today really gets started. Moving on, we've also got the imperial cult is something that we felt bears mentioning simply because the imperial cult for the emperors and the royal family in Rome spread throughout the provinces and gained a rather large amount of prominence, and is obviously very important for civic participation, and becomes is where a lot of these other religions can sometimes get in trouble with the Roman government. We're not going to talk about that one in as much detail, but good to remember that it exists as well. We have, at this time, you've obviously got your sort of store brand Roman religion still going strong. This is what we might think of as traditional Roman religion. I generally prefer not to use the term pagan because paganism is really just a sort of Christian, in some senses, also Jewish construction. And looking for a sort of single defined paganism is sort of an exercise in frustration, but we can definitely talk about traditional Roman deities and traditional polytheistic worship in these sort of general terms, and what it is. This is also sort of Christianity's, in some ways, main competitor, in that it is your most mainstream version of religion. But is important to keep in mind, store brand Roman religion is Roman, and not every place in the Roman Empire is Roman in the sense that they were originally part of Rome. And so you have continuing indigenous and local regional religious traditions that pre-existed the Romans and continue to exist after they get there. So in this sense, things like Germanic cults, Druidism in Gaul, these earlier religious traditions do continue to exist and continue to flourish in their various areas. Again, this is the sort of disclaimer of if we named every single tradition all over the ancient Mediterranean at this time, we would be here all day. But they do continue to exist, so it's good to keep them in mind. And new religions continue to emerge on the scene at the same time. So we've got all these different random Eastern cults that are popping up all over the place. Christianity is one of them. It is not the only one by any means.
And I was going to say, in the context of these religions, some of them were early that they had emerged, they gradually evolved. And then as these interact, people borrow, mishmash, put their religions together. Could you talk about the term, I think it's syncretism, which kind of describes that process?
Yeah. So syncretism is the process of combining essentially two different religious traditions into one. But we can also sort of talk about this culturally. One of the reasons it's actually come under some criticism in scholarship more recently is that syncretism, it implies that you can sort of take religion A and religion B, and that these things exist in this like pure, unadulterated, untouched form. And when you stick them together, you get religion C. And that would be nice if it were really that simple. But as is going to be a common refrain here, it's a little bit more complex than that. Nobody exists in a vacuum, which is kind of the point here, right? And so there's oftentimes what we find is there's no point when religion A and religion B aren't in some amount of contact. So where do you determine like what pure religion A without religion B is? So a lot of times we'll talk about hybrid religions as a sort of way to think about the way that religions can interact and borrow from each other without having to sort of imply that there is a pure form of one or the other that has then been changed or degraded into something different.
Great. And then I guess with that, we're going to go ahead and cover each of these topics that are struck with a gold star and kind of draw its parallels to the Christian narrative that we're trying to tell here. So I guess with that, we can get started with store brand Roman religion, which is, like you said, the main one that it's competing against, at least with respect to the ruling Romans. So yeah, what can you tell us about this religion?
Yeah, this is in some ways the best known, and therefore in some ways the easiest to explain and the hardest. So this is your sort of traditional polytheistic worship. Um, Probably if you've ever taken a myth class or done reading on that regard, you've heard at least a little bit about this sort of traditional pantheon of the Olympian gods, but traditional Roman religion is significantly larger than that. Not only do all of these gods have different cults in different places, and can in fact be worshipped under different aspects in the same place in multiple ways. You have local and regional variation as you might go to a particular place, and they have a sacred grove, and they have a god who lives there, and they have an ongoing religious tradition. And because it's not exclusive, those regional variations just sort of become subsumed and into the main practice. So you can worship Jupiter and worship your local Gallic deity, and that's not really a problem for traditional Roman religion. And so it allows for a lot of individual choice. Yeah, so the images on the screen here are all very different, as you can see, from how they're styled and even the objects that are associated with them. But these are all Jupiter. So the leftmost image is with Jupiter with the ram's horns. Might look a little odd, but that is Jupiter Ammon, which is an Egyptian version of the cult. And so you get these sort of varied and diverse forms of the same god. This is all Jupiter, but it's all a different version of him. Yeah, and so this allows for an amount of regional change as well. Is a big one there. And this religion is practiced in a variety of ways and in a variety of spheres. Right. So the imperial cult is sort of part of this, is also part of why this was that wasn't pulled out as a separate thing. But the imperial cult obviously is very, very closely tied into the emperor and his family, and therefore the Roman state. But there's also lots of state-sponsored religious festivals, or in the event of a crisis of some variety, the Roman state might take actions in order to use religion to solve the crisis. The cult of Asclepius on the Tiber Island was brought to Rome, according to Ovid, as a result and in response to a plague that was in Rome at the time. So there was a plague, and they're like, we need to solve this somehow, and therefore the state sent an embassy to Epidaurus and brought back this cult of Asclepius. In a time of plague, you need a healing god. So there's state-sponsored religious action happening at the top level, but also non-state sort of public worship, general temples and shrines that you might find even just on the streets. In Rome, there were quite famously a lot of street corner shrines, which is how we get to the Compitalia, which we'll talk about next. And of course, there's also domestic worship, in that you can worship in your home. And even though we've sort of teased these out as being different spheres of religious action, they're not really separate. They sort of exist on a continuity, so that the Minerva you're worshiping in your home, you might also dedicate her statue in a public shrine. And so there's a lot of movement between these spheres, even if we can talk about them individually. And the Compitalia, of course, is a festival that I thought was particularly illustrative of this, because it includes all of these. The Compitalia is a festival for the Lares, and in particular, it happens the Compites, which is the street corner, which is the street corner shrines I was mentioning before. And after a series of Augustan reforms, the street corners in Rome, every neighborhood had not only a neighborhood lar, who was a god of the neighborhood, kept the neighborhood safe, they also had an Augustan lar in particular, related to the imperial family. But you also had your own familial lar in your familial home, who was very important for protecting the household. So obviously the Compitalia really marries these multiple levels of action in one festival.
Okay.
Yeah.
And to summarize this kind of, if we're talking about marketplaces and this is a product being sold, I guess the advantage here of store brand Roman religion is that it plays really nice with other religions in the sense that, oh, you could super hybridize it with whatever the gods change form wherever they go. It's kind of familiar to the people who do practice polytheism, and you can see your own ancestral god in these new gods. So it's kind of interchangeable. And then, of course, you have the backing of the Roman government that is going to want to build these temples and kind of, oh, there's this local god here. Okay, we're going to smack the Roman label on top of it, and this is now the Temple of Zeus. And then they're sponsoring all these things, and then the elite class practices, so other people who want to enmesh with them might follow suit. So I guess it has like a momentum aspect to it, the pressures of overall government, and then it just kind of plays nice in terms of interacting with other religions, I guess, is the market advantage. Is that a decent take?
It does it all, right? So you can, whatever you need, you can get from traditional Roman religion. It is indeed traditional, and so it does have that the advantage of time on its side, as well as power. Yeah, in terms of state assistance, for throwing festivals and building temples, and all of those good things. Yeah, this is, I think, the bottom section is just that when we talk about paganism, when we talk about pagan, this is what we tend to mean. But yeah,
Got it. Okay, so if we're talking this is, and if we're saying this is the major religion kind of at the day, or at the time, there's a bunch of other ones, but let's pretend that this is, for the time being, the major one.
Yeah,
You're soon going to get disruptors. So let's start to get into those different disruptors, or ones that have stood as holdouts in the case of Judaism. So one of the disruptors I think you wanted to pluck out is Mithraism, which does kind of represent this broader emerging practice of mystery cults. So can you kind of talk us through this one and how it enters the marketplace and maybe how it competes therein?
So Mithraism is it's a kind of mystery cult, and a mystery cult, just like the name would suggest, is a cult that has a mystery attached to it. So when you are initiated into it as a cult practice, you then gain access to this hidden secret knowledge, including knowledge of their rites and beliefs, and then you are part of the cult. But you must keep the cult secret and hidden from outsiders who are not initiates. Hence the mystery part of things. So Mithraism is just a particularly prominent of these mystery cults. Mithraism appealed in large part to soldiers, and so actually we can see it spread along the movement of the Roman army very, very well. Yeah, this map has maps of major Roman army encampments and sites where we have found Mithraea, and you can see that they are very, very tightly grouped here. So the Roman army spreads it. Generally speaking, it's got this large following among soldiers. Yeah, and it's one of a large number of mystery cults. They're neither the first nor the last. We can actually see, in some cases, panic about mystery cults going as far back as the scandal of with the Bacchanalia, when the Bacchanalia is outlawed in Italy by the Roman Senate in 186 BCE out of fear that they're creating conspiracies. Even though this is like 400 years before pretty much anything else we're talking about today, even in the Christian period, there are Christian writers who still bring up the Bacchanalia as this like cannibalistic kind of violent mystery that's it's this conspiracy that is going to come and spew disorder and chaos onto the world. Despite the fact that Christianity itself actually uses the language of mystery cult for itself, that Christianity is in many ways a mystery cult. It considers its initiation through communion to be an initiation into the secrets of divine knowledge. It still does a lot of polemicizing against other mystery cults, including Mithraism. So that sort of fear about hidden practices, this sort of paranoia around what you might not be seeing, with these things that are being kept from you, continues on. Although, again, Christians are using this themselves. The Christian sacraments, that word that we still have in the modern period among Christianity, if you actually roll back, the Latin sacramentum in early Christian writers is often used as a translation for the Greek mysterion. So there's this continuity in terms of Christians doing mysteries themselves and situating themselves within mystery practices, but also really not liking their competitors who are doing other mystery things, because they are false mysteries. They give you false knowledge. That is a falsa religio, whereas Christianity is this true knowledge that you get from a true religion, and your initiation there is therefore the correct one.
And if we're going to draw kind of another conclusion here in terms of the appeal on the marketplace, if Roman religion is appealing because it's kind of universal, easy to adopt government backing, Mithraism kind of has a different angle to enter the market, which is, I guess, the appeal to mystery. But why might that make it more competitive in the marketplace? Is it because, oh, mystery, that gets people interested? That doesn't quite sound right. Or is it more like once you're in, then it's a really tight community and you feel more of a sense of belonging? Kind of what's the hook there?
Yeah, it's the insiderness that once you are initiated into it, you are part of it. A lot of mystery cults, and this is even beyond Mithraism, and including Christianity, also advertise a sort of eternal salvation element, that this is going to ensure you not just like well-being in the present, but your safety in the afterlife as well.
Okay, cool. So yeah, they're coming in and saying, join us. Once you're in, awesome. You have a brotherhood or a sisterhood or a sense of community. And then in addition to that, we're going to throw in the trump card that we're not just going to serve you in this life, but in the afterlife too, which is, I can see how that's competitive. Okay, so this is kind of a new player to the scene. We have Judaism here, which is perhaps instead of a newcomer, more of a holdout. So maybe talk about how this is in this marketplace.
Yeah, so Judaism is, as mentioned, it's not a newcomer in that sense. It's already established, mostly in the Eastern Empire. They've had experienced previous diasporas under, especially the Ptolemies are a big one for Egyptian populations, and have had a complex relationship with the government. In times, especially, there are several Judean revolts that happen under the Romans that the Romans don't love, where there's more persecution towards the Jews. And in other cases, we can also see allowances towards this sort of established religious community. So at different times and under different governments, sometimes Jewish active practitioners of Judaism are accepted from having to participate in public sacrifice, which is something that Christians get in trouble for as well. And so having that allowance allows Jewish communities to continue practicing without having to come into conflict over public sacrifice. So sometimes they're given these abilities to kind of do their own thing, and we know what you're doing is different, but like, that's fine, just don't cause trouble. And sometimes there is more conflict with the Roman government.
Okay, and if we're going to talk about, again, how each of these maybe competes in the market, Judaism isn't necessarily competing in the same way as the other ones. It's more about protecting what it has, and maybe its strength is its strong tie to a particular people and location, as opposed to the other ones are more, I don't know, what's the marketplace kind of angle on this one?
I mean, in large part, in the ancient world, Jews aren't always really considered a religious group. They are in many ways an ethnic group. So in like Ptolemaic Alexandria, they are just considered Judean, as in someone might be considered Athenian. You are from Judea in the way that someone else is from Athens. It's an ethnic association or an ethnic label more than a religious one in some ways. So yeah, it's this tradition, and you are continuing to do that tradition and protect it, and you want to make sure you can continue to do so even when the government's being a bit annoying about it. But it's not necessarily trying to compete in these different ways.
Got it. Okay, and then another one, I guess two more that are going to be entering the market. Next is going to be Sol Invictus, and this one, I think the idea here is we're going to be pulling in ideas of monotheism and the idea of how emperors start to get involved with religions.
Yeah, so Sol Invictus is a solar cult, as might be obvious from the label. It's not coming out of nowhere, although it is sort of gaining new traction in more of the second and third centuries. The solar imagery has long been associated with the imperial family and the imperial cult. All the way back to Augustus, the imperial family is using a strong association with Apollo, obviously also a solar deity, on coinage and in imagery. And we get a number of emperors as we go through who are attempting to strengthen solar worship. The Emperor Elagabalus, obviously very famous for this. Elagabal is a Syrian solar deity, very similar to Sol Invictus. And as we continue, these solar associations continue to sort of find their way in Christianity. So for emperors like Constantine followed Sol Invictus before his conversion to Christianity. It's not an enormous change in some ways. Yeah, it's also henotheistic, which is just another way to say Sol Invictus is sort of an exclusive deity. It's him and nobody else. As with Isis, what we talked about earlier, a sort of universal deity. This is another one that follows the army as well, and actually in many ways, in many areas becomes hybridized with Mithras, especially in later periods. We can see in some earlier stuff, Sol Invictus and Mithras are just sort of related deities. We can see Mithras described as an ally of the sun, but in later imagery, they actually just become sort of merged into one thing.
Okay. And I guess the appeal on this one in the marketplace is you take these store brand Roman religions, you focus in on one, which is Apollo. That's a consolidation of power therein, which has a lot of benefits in the marketplace for people who want to consolidate power. In this case, it seems like it's the emperors, but maybe others want to do so. Is that kind of how this one competes in the marketplace?
Yeah, it's very familiar, but also kind of doing the consolidation of power in one spot. So it's familiar in some ways in that Sol Invictus starts out as sort of another solar deity, but here we can see that it's become more exclusive.
Great. And then the final one is kind of going the other direction. Instead of being exclusive, why don't you just put everything in a pot and try and harmonize them, which I guess gets us to Manichaeism.
Yeah, Manichaeism is probably best known in the modern world because this is what Augustine is before he converts to Christianity. But it had an enormous geographic spread. This is a great little map. It shows Manichaean populations all the way from the ancient Mediterranean to all the way to China, and it has this enormous spread. Mani is the central figure for it, the prophet that Manichaeism is built around, but it also recognizes Christ and Buddha as being legitimate prophets. So it still recognizes the traditions of other religions, and it's heavily influenced by not just Jewish Christian beliefs, but you get a lot of Zoroastrian theology as well, and a lot of Buddhist ideas about religion and God. So it's this enormous melting pot. It travels all the way across Asia and sort of comes into contact with a lot of different ideas and traditions and blends those together. So in some ways, Manichaeism it takes a little bit of everything, and so it really does have this sort of, I think, global reach to it, and global appeal in some ways, because it incorporates elements that would be familiar to you across a very large range. They do tend to be persecuted pretty much everywhere across that range in the ancient world, but they do exist across it. So.
Yeah, and we could go on and on with different religions and how they compete in the marketplace, but I think this gives you a pretty good sense of the sampling. So again, to recap, tons of religions emerging here. There are different ways that there is no pure form of any religion. It's always going to be localized. It's always going to be borrowing or adapting from its neighbors, which we went over here. And then in terms of maybe if you did want to bucket these in terms of different types of religions, we went over major ways that they might compete and be appealing. To again recap, store-brand Roman religion it plays nicely. It adapts well to local deities. You can kind of borrow and hybridize with the locals. It has the momentum of being kind of the traditional practice of religion in many places. And then in addition, it's kind of the religion of the conquerors and of the elite, and other people want to emulate that or follow in its footsteps. So that's kind of its appeal. Mithraism is kind of one of many mystery cults that emerge. They are playing on not universality, but kind of community that you get from exclusivity, from being a part of this mystery cult. They then throw in the trump card that we're not just going to help you in the current day, but they're going to appeal to afterlives and how they might help you there. Judaism is one that's more like an ethnic focused one that has more about endurance and holding strong to tradition, more so than proselytizing. And then we get to some other ones. Sol Invictus is one that angles towards consolidation of power. It borrows some of the appeal of Roman religion, but then consolidates power and is appealing to emperors and other figures who want to take advantage of that. And then you have the final one, Manichaeism, which is like many others, which seeks to hybridize it. So yeah, you can see a bunch of different plays on how different people are evolutionarily winning out in the marketplace, and you get echoes of kind of what Christianity is gonna succeed upon from maybe all of these different categories, maybe taking bits and pieces of what's there. So that's it for the marketplace. And then, yeah, I guess we'll pivot from there into Christianity on the local level, how it emerges from this milieu and starts to spread. So Christianity on the local level, we're going to start off here with saying, well, how does Christianity kind of emerge from the small seed? I don't think we necessarily need to recap what is Christianity, but we can just kind of assume that, boom, Christianity is one of these new kind of practices that emerges. How does it spread? We're going to be looking at what is its appeal in the marketplace, and then we'll be looking at the spread through population centers, kind of how we find evidence of that in material culture, what it means in terms of people practicing it as it evolves, major heresies and things of that like. So as kind of the growing pains of early Christianity. So we could get started here, I guess, with spreading the word. So I guess maybe Kimball, if you want to give us a brief, maybe like 30 seconds, what is Christianity at its inception?
Yeah, early Christ religion it's this new cult that's preaching about a universal God. So of all these sort of boxes we're checking, it's promising eternal salvation. It does ask for an exclusive practice, so you're not doing other religions. It's just Christianity, and it's sort of promising salvation in return. It also, as it expands, gains sort of additional cults to saints and martyrs. So you are still getting these sort of minor cults associated with it, as well as this sort of centralized practice. Its very earliest iterations are going to be not in churches yet, but in meetings in domestic sphere, in people's homes. Eventually, of course, as it expands and becomes more authorized, it will start building churches and cathedrals and the like. But in its very earliest iterations, that's not yet happening. As it spreads, it's spreading through word of mouth by people, which is where we see it going as it starts going on the move. It spreads within existing social groups, not just within the family unit, but within ties of patronage that structured Roman society. It is obviously a religion with a very important sacred text, So it spreads through written word. We're still dealing with a very interconnected Mediterranean. So not just you happen to come across a Bible, but you might be corresponding through letters with groups elsewhere. It is looking to proselytize. It wants to convert people and is looking to do so quite actively. This obviously becomes much easier after persecutions ease off, but even in the earliest days, it is indeed looking to convert people.
Thanks. And as it does so, many other religions are going to be kind of following these same routes. Christianity isn't the only one that's getting word of mouth. Everyone else is. They're not the only person yelling on the streets about a new religion. So yeah, Christianity is doing this, but now we're going to be turning to what's the appeal? How does it compete with the other ideas on the marketplace? In this case, I think you had done some homework beforehand to kind of categorize this with just comparing it versus two other kind of major categories. First one is going to be store brand Roman religion, and the other one is kind of another comparative but generic mystery cult. So yeah, that's it that it's competing against for now. Again, there's a huge broader marketplace, but just for the sake of keeping this simple and illustrative, this is what we're going to be going through. And then I see here you've kind of given us different rows of things that might be of relevance to people that we can score it against. So do you want to kind of walk us through this, or maybe make some general comments?
Yeah, and as we look through this list, the checks and X's, some of these are broad, and some of these are just sort of things that religions just have. Right, so health and healing, appealing to religion for your well-being, checks across the board for that. There is an afterlife is something pretty much everyone agrees on. You're still going to be making offerings and dedications. You're going to have feast days and religious festivals. Like, these are just sort of things that don't necessarily change whether or not they exist between these different religious options, but you might change what they are in particular. But the fact that they exist is not different. Obviously, as we move down, we can see that although everyone has an afterlife and a conception of the afterlife, what Christianity and also mystery cults are offering you is that sort of eternal salvation, that you're going to be taken care of in the afterlife. Traditional Roman religion has ancestor worship and has sort of ideas of the especially if you die young, the sort of restless dead. It doesn't really offer you that kind of you're gonna be saved through God in afterlife idea. That's not really a traditionally Roman thing. Part of it, as well as we move into the anyone can do everything. There was some debate on this one, but basically the idea that not everything is open to everyone. For Christianity, anyone can be Christian, no matter your social status, civil status, whether you're enslaved or not, or your gender, but not everyone can do everything. There are some holy sites that are gender segregated or gender exclusive. Obviously, priesthoods are required to be are held by men. On the sort of traditional Roman religion side, you have in some ways a similar thing in that different deities and different cults are going to be exclusive to certain groups of people, and just aren't interested in appealing to everyone all the time. And so not everyone can do absolutely everything. Mystery cults are usually a little bit I guess democratic in some sense, right? If you are initiated into them, you can access that salvation. You are part of those mysteries, all the way back to the Eleusinian mysteries, which is the sort of major one people tend to know about in ancient Greece. Right, that appealed to foreigners, enslaved people, women, as well as Athenian citizens. So they have this broader appeal generally. Early Christianity allows more than nothing, right? In that if you're a woman, you can still achieve salvation. You can still be a saint or martyr. There are female saints and martyrs. You can't necessarily do everything. For direct state involvement, obviously, this is at the start of our history here, where traditional Roman religion is your state religion. So it's going to be getting this state support. It is worth noting that sometimes mystery cults do. You might have this state spending funds to renovate a Mithraeum, but in that case, it's more a renovation of the Mithraeum as a sort of extension of what it's already doing for more traditional. And it's a religion, and it's a reflection of the fact that those boundaries are fluid. Mysteries and initiation. Again, Christianity is doing mystery cult stuff in that you have to be initiated into it. Once you are, you receive this sort of revelation that is a central part of it. So it still thinks of itself as sort of holding these mysteries. Hierarchical organization is one that might confuse some people, and that early Christianity really doesn't have it very strongly. You have bishops who are in charge of their bishoprics, but beyond the immediate city where they're located, like there's not a lot of centralized control, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. And there's no, at this point, figure like a pope or somebody who is in charge of the whole organization. Roman religion, because it is in some ways state organized, often has some of that hierarchy more built in. So that's why it gets a check mark there. Sacred text gets a series of tildes and asterisks, because while all three of these generally have sacred texts, their approaches to texts and textuality can be somewhat different. Christianity tends to have the one sacred text, and every different instantiation of that text is sacred, in part because of what it contains rather than what it is. In traditional Roman religion, you might have particular books of prophecies that are sacred because they are prophetic, but they're not replicated in the same way. So yeah, like sacred textuality is not a new thing, but everyone has their own particular spin on it. Yeah, with demigods, depends how you want to consider them, but you still get saints and martyrs who can give out blessings and divine intervention and miracles and gifts in early Christianity. So that part really doesn't go away per se, even though you still have this sense of universal God. Yeah, and then people are still making pilgrimages and going to see holy sites and making dedications and offerings and asking for, again, blessings and things under Christianity. So a lot doesn't change. A lot does, but some things don't.
Okay. And if we're looking at competition, at least store-brand Roman religion versus these two mystery cults, it seems like what the two mystery cults have to offer, just to recap this, is both of them are offering eternal salvation, exclusivity, which means once you're in the community, it's much more tightly knit. Maybe a bit more inclusivity in terms of what people can do. It might appeal to people who are not in the ruling social class or who want to get access to some more social benefits. So I could see that happening there. Let's see. Yeah, so I guess those are the major ones. But then between the mystery cult and early Christianity, is there much of a differentiation between the two necessarily, or what would be the kind of the biggest driver? I guess it is kind of a stronger appeal to a universal God, which means maybe when it does get traction, it kind of stamps out the competition more efficiently. I'm not sure what would be the difference, the defining difference in these two.
Yeah, as Christianity expands, because it does include these sort of smaller cults within it, to saints and martyrs too. It is larger than just your sort of central God, which in some ways does differentiate it from things like Sol Invictus and Mithras, which are about Mithras but don't have these sort of additional aspects to them.
Okay. Great. And then, yeah, so we can see here how it's starting to appeal, how it might compete with other mystery cults. And then as it spreads, we've done a recap of what's the appeal here. Eternal salvation, again, that's for both mystery cults. And then it's tapping into this kind of messianic messaging and idea that is prevalent in the East that can have a broader appeal, and that ties in closely to this eternal salvation. And then kind of non-discriminatory with an asterisk. We kind of went over that in terms of who can be involved. It kind of breaks through some of these other barriers that you might otherwise have in place. So yeah, it does have some appeal. But in terms of its spread, it's going to be mostly tied to just, well, if we're talking about ancient days and it's spreading by word of mouth and social networks, that's kind of going to link you to where are the population centers. So in this case here, we just have a map of the Roman Empire with each dot showing population centers. But again, keep in mind that this is a mostly rural world. So even though these might be big dots showing cities, you would probably have even bigger dots representing the distributed population in the surrounding regions. But anyways, Christianity is going to be mostly spreading from these major centers.
Yeah, it really does start out as an urban religion, especially in the East. As it moves west, sometimes that rural spread gets ahead of it, but for the most part, your cities convert first, and so you have these sort of established centers and that it moves outwards from, and really, as well, it doesn't spread as far until the 4th century, which again, going back to what we talked about in the intro, the 4th century is when it gets really big and starts really moving beyond the Levant, Asia Minor, Greece, and stretching west is where we see that. Yeah. So we see a lot of early spread in the cities, but we also see some rural spread. And when we start seeing rural spread, a lot of times what we're seeing is the establishment of these villa churches. So they're villas that are obviously owned by private individuals who we might think of as being laity rather than within the religious organization, but that's not necessarily always the case. And so you have an aristocrat who's got this villa, who converts and puts a church on his private property, which then starts to draw in people from his traditional social network, right? It's spreading through patronage networks. So it's all the dependents within the household. It's all the tenants who farm his land. That can sort of become a hub within rural centers for the population. The downside of that, if you're a bishop in a city, is that sometimes these rural villa churches aren't necessarily within your control. They might have their own baptistries and be doing baptisms that you aren't doing. And so that becomes a point of contention for the early church as it's looking to establish control over what the practice of Christianity looks like, and who's determining how you do it.
Yeah, and that's one thing to note here is that Christianity, I guess its tenets aren't necessarily catered to an urban population. The major point here to say is just it's kind of spreading from urban place to urban place just as a consequence of how word of mouth works. But then, yeah, so one of the trends that you might see is, okay, Christianity is maybe more urban. I think later on, as Christianity does spread and starts to take over the Roman Empire, if you are going to try and look for quote unquote pagan regions, probably the rural areas are going to be your holdouts, and especially places that are just further away naturally from the site of propagation. But then in addition to that, even once Christianity does get into these rural areas, there's like this lapse in terms of Christianity. It localizes in the provinces or wherever in the rural area. But then let's say that maybe back in the city now they're having conventions and edicts and they're kind of restructuring. Here's how Christianity is. They are now going to be at odds with the rural community because there's this lapse and this kind of mismatch of how it's evolving. So it's a really interesting give and take of the Christianity maybe quote unquote spreading, but there's different versions of Christianity spreading. They're ever evolving, ever hybridizing. So it's a really interesting interplay that I think people don't give enough credit to when they think about the spread of Christianity. It's not a single tenet or system of beliefs.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, these rural areas are just less connected to your major population centers, and so communication is harder and more difficult when you can't just hop on the internet and share things in real time from across the country. Yeah.
And then to give a sense of the spread of Christianity here, we were having a discussion kind of offline before this, is like, can we provide the audience with any sort of context for like how much is Christianity spreading? Do we have any metrics for it? And unfortunately, it's really, really hard to get a sense of that. There are these maps kind of being bandied about, which show kind of where Christian congregations are. And so you can see in this map here the different dates. So, 100 years, Common Era, 200, 300. And you can see as it slowly spreads. So these pink ones mostly being centered in the east, into Anatolia, Greece, a little bit in Rome. Blue, you can start to pop up in the areas around it. And then the black is it's really spreading into North Africa, Spain, and the areas beyond. So, okay, we kind of get a sense of how it spreads, and we'll get into how archaeologists determine this. But then I guess in terms of like population analytics, some people have tried to derive estimates for, well, how much, what are the percentages over time? So can you kind of speak to that? This attempt to
Yeah.
quantify the spread?
Yeah, it's very, very difficult to really get an accurate number that we can be sure on for looking at larger rates of conversion to Christianity, just because it's very difficult to find the evidence. We can look at, obviously, the map here looks at the spread of congregations. We can look at churches that are being built later, but that doesn't necessarily show people. So the 10% number here is based on, in part, comparisons with contemporary groups that make major efforts to convert, and how successful those can be at spreading. And from that, this scholar sort of estimated as sort of maybe 10% of the senatorial class were Christian at the turn of the 4th century. So at 300. Which is where you can see this explosion of black dots on the map. So it was beginning to become widespread. It certainly wasn't as obscure as it was in like 100 CE, but it wasn't yet dominant. It certainly wasn't everybody by any means.
Yeah, and 10% you'd think is quite low. Again, that's from senatorial class. Maybe amongst certain populations in region it varied, but people would think, just looking at this map, oh, Christianity is on the up and up. It's about to take over the empire. Oh, what's it at? Like 50, 60%. And now we're seeing maybe closer to 10, which just shows just how much this religious marketplace is, like how much the pie is sliced up into these different religions. It's pretty impressive.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Yeah, and we'll get into kind of the material culture and how people have come about these assessments and understandings of the spread of Christianity. What traces do people leave behind? But one thing I wanted to address here is there is kind of this question that I want answered personally, which is, why did Christianity spread? And we're kind of following the beats to show that, hey, it's competing and it does spread. It's really hard to get an answer for why did it happen. So, for instance, let's say that, why didn't another mystery cult spread in this very same manner? Why didn't Mithraism spread to this extent? And I guess the sad answer, maybe you might have a different take on this, but I think my side answer is we just don't know. It's very hard to kind of quarterback, Monday night quarterback on this and deduce why it spread. We can theorize, maybe it's because the appeal of mystery cults means more brotherhood, more sense of community. Okay, it's maybe more infectious once it gets within a community. It can spread within social networks. Maybe it's this appeal to salvation. Maybe Christianity in particular has this, maybe it's a stronger monotheistic pull, so it's more exclusionary for other religions once it takes hold. Maybe it's more proselytizing in nature. I don't know. To me, it seems like we're not really going to get a concrete answer for why it necessarily took over. But I don't know. Do you have a take on it, being closer to the scholarship?
Yeah, and there have been some hypotheses, and I think if you compare with individual other religions, you might be able to come up with some answers. Mithraism, because it does appeal to soldiers and spreads that way through the army, but in some ways it doesn't ever spread beyond the army, so it doesn't ever get that sort of mainstream appeal outside of that particular demographic. People have attempted to hypothesize about Christianity appealing, and this is mentioned in the blurb we've got here, to enslaved people and women, right, to these social outsiders, which is probably in part just due to the preservation in the textual tradition of some very prominent women who then converted their families, which we get reported a fair amount, but like we just don't know. Yeah, I don't know that I actually have a good guess on this one. It just
Yeah.
does.
Yeah, and that's why I like these discussions. Is unfortunately many of them boil down to we don't know. But I think that the journey is what's important in understanding this and admitting that oftentimes we don't know, and the best we can do is kind of try and grapple with the mechanics and the dynamics at play. So it's hard to be intellectually satisfied with that, but I think we have to take some solace in that's kind of the lot we're given with history.
It leads
Yeah.
to some interesting questions, though, and those questions often do have answers. So that's the upside of things.
Yes. Okay, so I guess we'll leave it there in terms of the spread. So it is spreading. So we'll turn here into what are some ways that that traces are left in archaeology, and that's going to be material culture. So can you kind of talk us through this part?
Yeah. So we have obviously a plethora of religious texts that survive even from antiquity, that are Christian, especially from late antiquity forward. But often these texts they're written by particular people, they're written by elite men, they're written from particular perspectives, they have particular biases, and they don't tell us everything. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't. But also, like, we have a material existence. None of us are just sort of this intellectual, spiritual blob floating in not space, because you wouldn't exist in space if you weren't material. We all have this physical existence, and so looking at that is very important for the study of religion, and it also is very important for supplementing what we have in terms of evidence, because people leave evidence. They build buildings that we might still have. You're going to be using objects in your worship, whether they're icons and relics. They might be souvenirs that you brought back from a pilgrimage to a local shrine, books, all kinds of things. Even in the modern world, think of all the material objects that you interact with on a daily basis, your built environment, how you communicate. I found the other day a place where you can get socks with pictures of the saints on them, right? You can, and even on that granular level of your socks, that you can in some ways incorporate religious life into your material existence, the clothes you wear. Maybe you have jewelry with the cross on it to signal to other people that you are Christian. So you can use all of these physical elements in order to communicate your religious affiliation and perspective and practice, and to do religion. You might communicate with letters or books. You might graffiti something religious on the side of a building, or be listening to music that you then have to play with an instrument and listen to with your ears. And so there's all this physical stuff around religion. And the downside of this is that if we're dealing with ancient religion, a lot of this doesn't survive. Much of it is ephemeral. We know of at least one shrine where pilgrims could go and get a particular sacred soap at, and we don't have that soap. It has not survived, especially anything organic its survival is very contingent. It has to be in very, very particular circumstances, which is why we get a lot of papyri out of garbage dumps in the middle of the desert, because the desert preserves things, or we might get things out of bogs because bogs also happen to preserve things. But we make do with what we have, and what we have can often tell us a lot of things that the textual tradition can't. We can look, for instance, does your healing sanctuary have a ramp? Is it accessible to people who are limited in their mobility? In the ancient world, this was often a yes. Actually, we can look at the frequency of ramp building in religious sanctuaries, and we can see that they are much more frequent in healing sanctuaries, where people who are sick or elderly or are disabled and who are looking for healing might be going and might need a ramp to access rather than stairs. And so we can look to material culture for evidence of things that we can't necessarily see otherwise. And we can look to material culture for people we can't always see otherwise, which is the other fun side of things. So we can look at For instance, if you were doing a pilgrimage to a site, you needed someplace to stay. So we can look at accommodations for people at sanctuary sites and say, oh, are these gender segregated? Do we have 2 side-by-side toilets? Is it just sort of everybody all together? Like, what accommodations do we have? Or there's a site that's for Saint Simeon the Elder in what is now modern day Syria, where we can see that there is the main sanctuary and there's a baptistry outside the sanctuary. This is very unusual. Usually when we get baptistries at religious sites, you get them attached to the main church, so that after you're baptized, you emerge into the holiest part of the site. You don't want to sort of be baptized and sort of walk out onto a random sidewalk. You want to walk into the center church, but here it's on the outside. And we can see that this is because St. Simeon the Elder's cult was gender segregated. If you were a woman, you were not allowed to enter the sacred space. But you might still make a pilgrimage there, and you might still want to be baptized there. So the baptistry is outside the sanctuary so that women can still access it. And this means that even though the site itself was gender exclusive, that you could not enter as a woman, there were still sufficient numbers of women making pilgrimages there to require that the baptistry be built outside. And so we can see women's pilgrimage in that way, in a very unexpected way, where the textual tradition might suggest that women didn't go there because they weren't allowed in. So all that's a very long way of saying material culture can tell us a lot, and it is very, very important evidence. Within early Christianity, we can also use it to sort of trace where it spreads. Where are you building churches? Where is your iconography going, right? The inscribed Chi Rho, where do we see it? When do we see it? And the answer for early Christianity is that we really don't see it much until the 4th century. It just wasn't big enough yet. Maybe, especially in urban environments, you might meet in somebody's home and it might not have decoration that was Christian. It might not have a sort of architecture of the home that is specifically Christian yet. That does happen later. You can get these oratories in private homes that might have. The one example here is it's decorated with pictures of saints, but maybe you would put the text of a prayer on the wall, and that would be part of your prayer room. That include the prayers that you are doing and part of your religious practice. So we do eventually see it explode on the scene, but we don't see it yet until the 4th century. And of course, all of this is challenged by the fact that so much of what existed doesn't survive. So we're always fighting against the idiosyncrasies of survival. Maybe there was more stuff that we haven't seen yet or haven't found yet, or that just got destroyed in ways that we haven't been able to reconstruct it. Yeah, but mostly 4th century is where we start seeing early Christian material culture get big.
Yeah, and the last note I'll say on this is obviously this is the grunt work of research that goes into being able to create, even if it's a guess or somewhat paint these somewhat blurry pictures of the spread of Christianity, informs us on the marketplace of ideas, what these different religions are proposing or offering, and how they spread. All of this boils down to the grunt work being done by academics and people in the field. And one of the major things to note, one, is that not much of it survives. And 2, the stuff that does survive, archaeological practices are improving. Digs are still constantly going on. We're reinterpreting old information. So even though the stuff is thousands of years old and we may think we know the story, all of this is still very much fresh, subject to revision. Hopefully we get a better picture, but it's always a constant work in progress. The Dead Sea Scrolls that get discovered, different things like this that can change up our understanding or the trajectory or the timeline of things. There's still much to be learned and gleaned and revised for our story.
Yeah, and new digital methods are definitely an enormous help with that. Yeah, reading through site reports from archaeological digs doesn't feel very, very glamorous, but it does yield so much important information, and it will continue to. So there's still more to find.
Yes, and then with that, we'll kind of close up this section of Christianity on the local level with maybe a couple ideas, which is okay. We have this idea of material culture and studying it lets us see, well, how does it actually manifest on the ground level? We've talked somewhat about population mechanics, but it's not really grounded in the individual. You'll notice we're talking about abstract ideas, marketplaces, kind of population centers and trends. But now we're going to get down to the kind of some of the nitty gritty of like, well, how does it affect people on the day to day? What does it look like? So we'll go through this, I think, just rather quickly. But yeah, major points would be that, yeah, this early Christianity is um, not the Christianity we think of today. So maybe you could give us a brief recap on this without full details, but at least enough to give us a sense of how it might differ.
Yeah, and this is just especially a lot of a reminder that the Christianity of the fourth century is very much still informed by these other practices that we've been talking about. So it has these holdovers. You might still be making offerings to your ancestors and engaging in ancestor worship in ways that aren't necessarily thought of as being like mainstream Christian beliefs. Or you might still have the lares that actually were mentioned earlier with the Compitalia, which are your sort of household gods. And you might be holding on to these. You might still be continuing to do that sort of domestic worship that you did under more traditional Roman religion as you move into Christianity. And of course, you still have like things that continue to be similar. You have feasts of saints and martyrs. A lot of early Christians are very worried about especially Augustine, but even other people are also worried about like people getting too out of control with these feasts and celebrations that feel a little bit too pagan. I've also mentioned the January calends, which are actually not pagan, but they were thought of as being pagan. The calends of January, the calends are just the first of the month. So the January calends is the New Year. It's a civic holiday, essentially. It's the day that civic offices changed hands on the Roman calendar. People usually had a feast and would often give each other presents. Here we have a lamp with happy and lucky New Year on it, giving the gift of light as a gift of good luck for the new year was a very common way to bring in the year. So you still have these holidays floating around that they're not actually pagan, but they feel pagan and have these associations of being pagan. They're maybe thought of as being a bit too rowdy. We have Augustine telling his congregation, not to go out and celebrate with the pagans, or like if you go out and celebrate, you don't feast and you don't give gifts like they do. You have to be different. You have to be proper and upright and Christian in how you celebrate. So part of one of the conflicts in sort of the development of early Christianity is how pagan it should continue to be, and whether it should continue to do things pagans do, where it gets a little rowdy sometimes and throws a feast, or not, or to be sort of celebrate the martyrs in a more intellectualized kind of way, where you take inspiration from their perseverance through God as a way to sort of reflect, but you don't necessarily go out and like feast and dance.
Yeah, and the if you look at ancient religious calendars or even cultural calendars, whatever, they're chock full of holidays that celebrate a bunch of different things. So you can imagine, as a member of a Christian religion, people are out rowdy partying in the streets doing whatever, and you're kind of roped into it. You might want to take part, or as Kim was saying, you might want to abstain from certain practices to keep your things separate. But you're in this sphere where the town and kind of the beat of the city is going about these different holidays that often coincide with celebrating a new year or collecting of the harvest, or a winter festival. These things happen in all sorts of cultures, and as Christianity expands and begins to dominate, it's going to try and co-opt these major holidays, and in doing so, like you said, religious leaders are going to try and find what's the best way to do this. Do we keep many of the traditions? Do we excise some parts? Do we inject other parts that are from our religion? But there's always going to be a tendency for humans to want to celebrate around these major kind of phases of the year, I guess.
Yeah, and that's part of it, is that you can't necessarily stop people, even if you tell them, hey, this celebration is bad, don't do it. Clearly what we're seeing is that people are going and celebrating in this way, and religious leaders aren't necessarily keeping them from that.
Yeah. And then moving on, Chris had wanted us here to talk about magic in a Christian world. This is another one of these ideas where early Christianity, as it's enmeshed and kind of running parallel to these other religions, has some aspects that we don't think of today, or maybe magic still is today in the Christian world. It's just not really seen necessarily as magic. But in antiquity, all these religions are practicing magic and having, curses or ways to heal one another or superstitious beliefs all enmeshed. And Christianity is very much, partaking in that idea. So can you give us a sense of kind of, I guess, as the title says here, magic in the Christian world and what that means for our discussion?
Yeah, and part of it too is that early Christians do a lot of polemicizing against magic, against divination. One of the really earliest trends in the legislative side of the early Christian emperors is that a lot of them outlaw divination. And yet Christianity has a lot of prophecy in it. And what is the difference between divination and prophecy, you might wonder, whether or not it's done correctly. So yeah, magical practices that predate Christianity just continue trucking along. You might be invoking different gods, with binding curses in particular, right? You might be invoking angels rather than these different deities. You might use the tetragrammaton, but you're still doing more or less the same thing. You're still inscribing your curse on often a sheet of lead. It can really be anything though, and depositing it somewhere. You're still getting your horoscope done. Astrology continues to be enormously popular. It's enormously popular pre-Christianity. It's enormously popular post-Christianity. If you did, for instance, the Sortes Virgiliana in the Sortes Biblicae, this is just lot divination from books. Right? Open your codex to a random page and stick your finger down and see what it tells you to get your fortune that way. But you're going to be doing it with the Bible now instead of with Virgil. So you're doing it in a slightly different way, but a lot of these practices really just keep going well into the future.
Yeah, and then the degree to which Christianity is bending or adapting itself, or it's really kind of a crisis of how do we define ourselves moving forward. That is going to spawn, everyone's going to have a different answer to it and different kind of pressures in the marketplace, which yields this last page here, which is kind of the growing pains of early Christianity, where, like we said, you adapt to different areas, and then there's this differentiation in how much you spread in an urban versus a rural area, and then kind of it's a vibrant marketplace where all these changes are happening and huge divergences are going to occur. So could you talk to us a bit about kind of these growing pains?
Yeah, and without getting into the map, just gives you a really good idea of how many different sort of splinters of Christianity are happening. And this is not even an exhaustive map. Because there's no sort of singular centralized way to regulate Christianity yet. There will be. You end up with these regional differences, and sometimes these regional differences are theological, or someone has a sort of theological idea and people tend to follow it, and other people somewhere else disagree. People have speculated to what extent, for instance, Arianism, which was a major heresy, was actually important for your sort of ordinary Christian. They might not even notice the difference between Arians and Catholics and really might not care. And in some places, these are affected simply by regional factors that aren't relevant to other places. For the Donatists, one of the major issues is that there is a governor of Roman North Africa, which is where you will find Donatists on the map, who requires that Christians turn in their Bibles to be destroyed. And the Donatists are very much against this. If you handed over your Bible, you were a traditor. It just means you turned your Bible in. And they think that this is heretical. This is against what proper Christians would do, that you can't compromise in that way. But this is just based on a local pressure because it's based on a regional governor. If you're in Asia Minor, this simply isn't relevant to you because you haven't been existing under that law. Eventually, as we begin hitting the conversion of Christian emperors, you'll start getting councils that are attempting to sort of marshal all of this disorder into something unified and orderly. But it's in the early Christian world, it's still a struggle to sort of get everybody on the same page. And one might dispute whether or not Christians ever really do this, given how many different Christianities still exist today. But that is a much larger issue and a question for some other time.
Yeah, and just to give people a sense of this, so not everyone is going to be familiar with these ancient Christian sects and quote unquote heresies, but can you give us a sense on what are the major pillars that people are disagreeing upon? Because it's not just, oh, I practice this holiday versus you stay inside, I go outside. There are pretty major disagreements that go all the way up until whether or not I think Jesus is the same as God or all this other stuff. So can you give us a sense of like how big are these fractures and divergences that are occurring?
Yeah, I mean, they do go all the way to the nature of the Trinity, and uh, whether Jesus is right, like born or pre-exists and that kind of thing. These sort of very top level theological questions, down to smaller doctrinal questions. Again, for the Donatists, one of the big issues was the very, when I think of it like as a actually pretty secular issue in terms of like how do you interact with the government. We can also see the Manichaeism makes it onto the map as a sort of Christian offshoot, right? Do you recognize new prophets, or do you sort of put the wall at Christ and say he is the last one? We don't recognize anybody else. Do we recognize different gospels? There's a large body of writing that's circulating this period, and it still hasn't yet been decided what all is canon and what is not. So that's also a question that's being decided. What is your actual source material for deciding Christianity?
Yeah, and people will be hopefully familiar with that today, where we still don't have disagreement today. Now, rewind back where there's no internet. All of this takes a long time to figure out, and it's spanning over centuries. And you can imagine just how splintered and fractured this was at the time. Cool. So that gets us through Christianity on the local level. The general idea is, okay, maybe it's diverse and fractured, but it is spreading. It's getting a larger share of the marketplace. Maybe it's only 10%, and that's not a majority, but maybe it's enough of a plurality where you can start to now you're with the big dogs, and you can start to interact with the higher structures of society. And so that'll be the next level, which is Christianity enters this phase where it's now playing with potentially government institutions. All right, so Christianity on the high level, we'll be looking at Roman government and its existing power structures that are going to be slowly kind of taken over by Christianity. We'll look at kind of as it starts to interact with the power structures, and maybe there's, anytime you try and change power, there's going to be friction, and that may, in this case, lead to persecution. And then we'll say, in the face of adversity, how do you start building this new religion? And then eventually, how do you get to the very pinnacle of the power structure with the emperors? So we'll get started here in the beginning with religion and government, and kind of, can you give us an idea of just summary level, what's the Roman take between religion and government?
Yeah, the Roman government is, generally speaking, fairly tolerant of religion. They really don't care much what you're doing with your religious life. They're not looking to regulate that. It's not really feasible in the ancient world to regulate it on a deeper level, as long as you don't cause problems. So that's where we get these asterisks. If you are going to be working against the government, if you're going to be disobeying local laws, especially those around participating in sacrifice, things can get sticky. But for the most part, they're pretty content to sort of let people do their own thing. Roman government controls this amount of territory that is just enormous and goes well beyond Rome itself. They know not everybody is going to be doing the same religious stuff in that large amount of territory. So for the most part, yeah, live and let live. It's fine. Do your thing. Don't cause problems.
And I guess the only way that the government may want to quote unquote like endorse, or there may be an official religion, is just to the extent that, oh, the rulers kind of, and the power structure kind of follows this religion, and they may have a preference for sponsoring certain types of religions, building their temples, things like that. Maybe that's the extent of their like officially endorsing religion. I don't know.
Yeah, especially in the Republican period, still have the sense that the Roman government is, or the Roman state is, in charge of ensuring the pax deorum, the peace of the gods. The gods you want to keep on your side, and you want to make sure everything is good with that. So you need to build temples in order to cultivate those relationships, and that is a responsibility of the Roman state, is to do things like temple building and build that religious infrastructure. But yeah, it's not necessarily doing a kind of state religion in the same way.
Yeah, and as we've alluded to before, government may show preference for some things, just like you said. In certain cases, they may try and stamp down on certain religions. Certainly, you could say it occurred with Judaism, but that's kind of tied into kind of a rowdy community in the East and kind of everything that's going on there with revolts and whatever. But I guess other cults, the Bacchanalian cult was something that had to be rooted out. Legislation was passed and whatnot. So there are some suppressive instincts that sometimes the Romans do have to roll in, whether it be boots on the ground or, legislation. I think here we had a picture of book burning. I don't know if that's ever something that comes up, but maybe can you real briefly touch on maybe suppression?
Yeah, we can. I think the Bacchanalia incident is a good example here, because technically they don't outlaw following Bacchus as such. What they outlaw in the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus in 186 is that they pretty much outlaw any kind of organizing hierarchy or getting together as a group to do anything, which pretty much outlaws most things you could actually do as a religion. When you can't get together in groups of more than 5, and you can't appoint priests, and you can't have a treasury as a religion, therefore you can't raise money in order to do anything. You can't have anyone sort of appointed as a leader to any kind of leadership position. So they can make things very difficult, and that is indeed mostly about it's a worry that people are going to be causing conspiracy, doing a conspiracy against the state. So it is these state level issues that cause people to sort of go in. People do burn books in the ancient world. That is sometimes a thing that happens. It does happen for Christians in particular under Diocletian, sort of turn of the 4th century. It's not a very effective way to perform censorship. You're not going to get every book. You're not really going to prevent books from circulating just by burning particular versions of them. But it is a very good symbolic way at communicating your religion is out. We don't want you doing that. Stop it. So that's really what that's more about, is a sort of a warning shot, really.
Yeah, and then returning to our kind of timeline here, we're kind of now entering the tipping point where Christianity gets large enough to draw the attention of the powers that be. That does lead to some friction. You have precedents with the cult of Bacchanalia, where Rome may clamp down. You have precedents in Judea, where there may be some revolts and troops are sent in, different sorts of persecution. So Christianity in our timeline right here is just about getting to that point. It's going to get past that tipping point eventually, and we'll get to that. But right now, we're kind of covering this frictional transition point. So I guess that brings us into the next part, which is persecution. So just to tee this up, we have prior instances of persecution with other religions. We just touched on that. We could talk real briefly about persecutions with respect to Christianity. And again, I guess therein, there is kind of this play on this idea of persecution as kind of like a propaganda tool on both sides within Christianity. Early Christians later Christians, even modern day Christians who want to play with it different ways. And there is this idea of what really happened in terms of persecution. So I know this is a dense, potentially hairy topic, but can you kind of give us an overview of Christian persecution?
Yeah, so we do see Christians getting in trouble with the Roman government all the way back to Pliny is a provincial governor in the first century CE, and writing to Trajan about he's like I've got these Christians causing problems. Like here's what I'm doing about them. Here's all this stuff. Trajan's like yeah whatever. I've never heard of these guys. Do what you want. But as Christians become more prominent in the empire, you do see more active from the very top persecution against them under Valerian in the late 3rd century, Domitian very early part of the 4th. So you do get things like book burnings and prohibitions against meetings and confiscations of property that do happen. Usually this is somewhat regionally dependent. Often the emperors will sort of let the regional governors decide what they want to do. We've mentioned the Donatists before. Again, that's just a singular regional governor sort of trying to interpret what his orders are from above and saying, oh, I'll take your Bibles, I guess. Yeah. And we do have Christian martyrdoms in this period, although not necessarily in all the places people think of them. There were never any Christian martyrdoms in the Roman Colosseum, for instance, although there were in other areas. This all sort of comes to an end eventually in 311 with the Edict of Toleration. This actually predates Constantine. It protects Christians from official persecution. It doesn't really go much further than that, but it offers some protection for Christian worship. Constantine, as the first emperor to actually convert to Christianity, is the first to really start throwing Christians a bone on some of these things and easing their way legislatively, making sure they're exempt on the official government level from performing public sacrifice, which is often where things get hairy. So this persecution happens in the first couple centuries, really in about a 50-year span between like 260 and 310 is about where most of it lands. And then it does ease off as Christians gain protection under the law. Yeah. And yet it remains a significant part of sort of Christian cultural and religious memory. The fact that martyrs are venerated in the way that they are means that those stories of martyrdoms and persecution continue to be sort of active living memory, even long after they are no longer actually happening in anyone's Christian world. Yeah. So
Yeah, so
yes,
it certainly did
happened.
happen. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. At their most severe, people were killed, and those martyrdoms are remembered in different ways through the religion, but they really don't continue for very long. Within about 50 years, you have the Edict of Toleration. You have Constantine as the first Christian emperor, and from there on, it's really smooth sailing, unless you're part of a version of Christianity that the emperor doesn't like, of course, and then you are a heretic and not a Christian, and things get hairier again. But if you are a Christian in good standing with the state, then after 311, you're pretty okay.
Yeah. Yeah, you'll probably see online these people saying, myth of persecution, it's invented, blah, blah, blah. We're not going to wade into that. But one of the things that was interesting that you had mentioned to me kind of before this talk is persecution does certainly make for a good conversion story, a good story to tell that can help in the marketplace of ideas. And I think one of the things you told me is, I think someone had looked back and see how persecution was factoring into kind of Christian worldview and thought and communications. And it kind of even changed over time within Christianity, how much it was being talked about or played up or played down, and kind of the twist they gave on stories. So I found that even super fascinating.
Yeah, that was in particular with the account of the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicitas. That over time, um, Felicitas is an enslaved woman, but over time, that sort of social position of hers, where she is very much, she's at the bottom of the social ladder. She is essentially a non-person because she is enslaved and Christian. That social component of her identity starts to be watered out of the story as it continues to be told. So it's no longer about an enslaved woman standing up against this persecution. The persecution is still part of the story, but her status is no longer quite as central to it as that story is transmitted throughout antiquity.
Awesome. So Christianity gets through this kind of growing pains with persecution. As it's doing so, this is in the backdrop of it growing. And so real briefly, we can talk a bit about, well, how does it grow as a religion? So you have some things about like churches, festivals, things like that, physical infrastructure, but then also there's social infrastructure in terms of we have, the organization of the early church and things like that. So uh, talk us through a little bit about growth of kind of the infrastructure of Christianity, physical and social.
Yeah, the physical infrastructure is it is a big change. As mentioned earlier, early Christians just met in people's homes because they didn't have these sort of permanent buildings where they could go worship. As repression against Christianity eases off, you can build church buildings, and you can even build them in prominent places, and the state might help fund them. So as we move through the 4th century and the 5th century, we start to see more temple destructions, and more church building. So you can see on the material record how things are moving religiously. It means that the government can sponsor things like feast days for saints, or festivals. So it allows you to do things officially in a way that is very helpful if you're a religion. Yeah.
And there was a great image that I think you helped source, which shows the conversion of these sites. You have a Circus of Caligula, which eventually over the centuries is going to get adapted and changed, and eventually becomes St. Peter's Basilica.
Yeah, and this is a really great one because you can see so well that like there is the sort of outline of the circus as it exists in its first form, and then you can see the additions to it, sort of incursions onto it, until it is no longer a circus at all, even though you can still kind of see the outline of the shape of it, and it is just St. Peter's Basilica.
Yes, and you'll see this happening across the empire as existing infrastructure is repurposed, adapted, and all that. Great. So that's kind of touching on the physical. How about the social side of things?
Yeah, so we've talked a fair amount about how early Christianity was a little bit Wild West in terms of who got to determine theology and doctrine. As the emperors, starting with Constantine, convert to Christianity and start to be Christian, they start to get involved with this and trying to sort of sort things out. So you have Constantine calls the first Council of Nicaea to determine doctrinal questions. But you also have emperors like Theodosius, who, when he is made emperor, kicks out all of the Arian bishops in Constantinople and the surrounding area, and appoints only Catholic bishops. So you have this secular authority that's still acting with power within the church, as the emperors are sort of starting to get involved and trying to regulate things and determine what is heresy, what is not heresy. We need to kind of get this sorted out and organized.
And in terms of a structure here, I just found this primitive kind of pyramid structure, but I think roughly we're talking about congregations that have their own leaders, and then they have kind of a higher echelon, and eventually you get kind of the overall bishop, and he may have a region that he's in charge of. And then kind of as Rome grows, right, I think these bishops and these dioceses, they kind of merge with Rome's idea of provinces and all that. And it's kind of the structure that starts off small in people's living rooms or whatever, eventually grows and kind of melds with Rome's conception of power structures.
Yeah, and eventually that does become much more centralized. In the beginning, it's still sort of you're the bishop and you have your area that you're in charge of, but there's not necessarily a lot regulating. There's not a lot of connective tissue regulating things between regions and between bishops, and that does get built as we move through the 4th and 5th centuries.
Awesome. So yeah, and then I guess at this point, growing pains, you get through the persecution gauntlet. Once that kind of gets lifted and you're accepted, you can compete more readily in the marketplace of ideas. Now you start to tap into the resources of the state and the higher powers that makes you more attractive as a religion. Now you're going to start to grow more and more, but still you have perhaps the impediment of the overall state, which if it really devoted itself to, could probably tear you down or cause you a lot of hardship. So now we get to the final stage of kind of Christianity's growth, which is going to be the overall power of the state and the emperor.
All right, so we're actually going to start here when we're looking at the emperors, not at the beginning, but in more of the middle, with Julian, who is emperor from 361 to 363 CE, so middle of the 4th century. This is after Constantine, but well before like Justinian in the 5th century. Julian is called Julian the Apostate often among Christians, because as the apostate, obviously he is not Christian. He is attempting to restore paganism to the empire, and this is not successful, in part because he's only in power for 2 years. There is a sort of hope that he's able to revive pagan practices, to ensure the protection of pagan temples. The 4th century, really going all the way back to the beginning, is a period of immense temple destruction or temple conversion and reuse, spoliation. And so there's hopes that he's able to stop this. He was actually born Christian, and then recanted later, and obviously by the time he was in power is not Christian. But he's only in power for 2 years. There are Christians on either side of him. This attempt to restore, to sort of implement a pagan revival, is unsuccessful.
And I guess the main idea here being is that in traditional simplified timelines of this period, Christianity has already triumphed, but we're bringing Julian up to show that it's still very much kind of in contention. There's some wobbling, and there are some historical what ifs about kind of a backlash to Christianity.
Yeah, it's easy to sort of look at that sort of the march of Christianity, or the triumph of Christianity, is the infographic you had pulled up, and that doesn't even mention Julian, because he's not part of that sort of triumphal progression of a Christian state forward, but he is there. It's not a sort of done deal even post Constantine. There's still this back and forth over the future of the empire, and he's part of things. Yeah. Okay. He's obviously following the beginning of the implementation of Christianity at the highest level. So as we get into things, we should roll all the way back to Constantine too.
Yeah, I think he was a useful insertion to show that it's not inevitable, it's not linear, there is some back and forth. But then, yes, to your point, we should get back to the emperors, which is, okay, hold on. How did Christianity first get to the emperors in the first place? We talked further back about kind of infiltration or expansion across the marketplace, but then how does it actually get to the emperors? So now we'll rewind a little bit with that kind of disclaimer in mind to say that it's not linear, but okay, let's go back and rewind to its introduction to the imperial family, I guess.
Yeah, and a reminder here that right at this point in time, even by our sort of upper estimates, maybe 10% of the senatorial class was Christian. Maybe. At most, it might have been more in the East. It was probably much less in the West. Hard to say, but like this isn't necessarily a super prominent religion when Constantine is in power. Now, the sort of story people tend to know about Constantine and his conversion. There's a civil war in Rome. There's a lot of civil wars in Roman history, but one of them is happening when Constantine is in power. He instructs his soldiers to put the Chi Rho. Chi Rho are the first two letters of Christos, so it becomes an early symbol for Christ and Christ believers. He brings that into battle and receives a vision and triumphs at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, and then converts and is Christian. But that doesn't really give you a lot on like why Christianity, or really what he felt about religion before or after. So Constantine does convert, again, famously at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. The Edict of Toleration had been put in place already, but the 313 Edict of Milan is the one that people tend to know. It basically does the same thing the Edict of Toleration does. It protects Christians and Christian worship, but it also gives back some amount of confiscated property, and does a little bit more for Christians than just saying, we won't persecute you anymore. Constantine, before his conversion, we actually mentioned him above, because he had been a follower of Sol Invictus. So he had already been doing henotheistic solar worship before his conversion to Christianity. The monotheistic part of Christianity isn't new to him. So it might be that there's also an appeal in that. It's something that's familiar. Again, solar imagery continues to be associated with Christ throughout this period. So there's a lot of overlap in ideas there. It's also worth noting that Constantine, even though he does convert to Christianity, is another one of these, remember that not everything here is exclusive. So he continues to cultivate and to promote the imperial cult in the provinces. He's still building non-Christian temples and temple infrastructure to certain cults, although not all of them. And so there's still, even with Constantine, some amount of like a sort of asterisk on making him a sort of first Christian emperor. But he is where things start. And then, except for Julian after him, at that highest level, people have converted or are born Christian. And so his descendants and his successors are Christian. And it has sort of, he's the starting point if you're looking at it from a more institutional perspective. One other emperor we wanted to highlight here was Theodosius I, who is emperor at the end of the 4th century, who issued a large number of edicts starting around 380 and well into 390, regulating Christianity, its place in the empire. He's usually the one who's credited with making Christianity officially the state religion of Rome. He is also weighing in on doctrinal and theological issues. He's the one who expels from Constantinople, which is at that point the capital in the east, expelling from Constantinople the Arian bishops and ensuring that Catholicism is the sort of official Christianity, and declaring these other strands of it to be heretical. So he's important in that respect too, in that he's helping shape what version of Christianity moves forward. And then one last person we wanted to highlight, and we're going to jump way forward here, all the way to the mid-6th century, is Justinian. Because if Constantine, institutionally speaking, is our beginning point, Justinian is your end. The Justinian Code requires the baptism of all pagans in the empire. It includes strict provisions against heresy. It includes strict provisions against not being Christian, even in private life. And so this is really your point where Christianity is the law of the land, in a way that it's not even with Theodosius. So that's a sort of really big change to highlight as we approach the end of the 6th century.
Yeah. So I think this has been a great discussion. That's the last of our kind of formulated talking points, and so now we can kind of give final thoughts. I'll start with mine and just let you have the final word. But to me, the major takeaway as someone who's not necessarily enmeshed in this history and has gone through the learning process with you is I'm quite impressed on basically how messy it is, which is always the case with history, and I just love learning about it. But I mean, look at this timeline here, where you go from birth and death of crucifixion of Jesus all the way to Justinian, and even at this late date, what we found in the process is Constantine. Oh, this is the great Christianity takes over the Roman Empire. But we saw here, as maybe this isn't the most accurate prediction, but we're not talking about much more than a quarter of the population, maybe even closer to 10% of the senatorial class. It's very, very gradual, quite glacial. That's the major thing that I take away from it. It's just how gradual it is, how nonlinear it is, and very much, I guess, how the transition therein carries on a lot of the practices that we talked about before. There was this blending of Christianity, merging of holidays. There is still a continuation and very much of this marketplace of religions that either still exist or are being hybridized or practices are being co-opted. So very much a messy, gradual transition, more so than you would find in our initial kind of inevitable triumph of Christianity here. So that's kind of what the process looks like. As to answering our initial question about, well, why did Christianity triumph? I guess the conclusion here is there's no simple answer. We don't know definitively, but maybe a sense of why that might be the case would be looking at kind of this marketplace approach and seeing that, mystery cults in general do have sort of a competitive edge when it comes to bringing in this trump card of your afterlife, salvation, camaraderie within a community, some other aspects of more universal inclusion, and then Christianity within the context of mystery cults maybe has a further advantage in maybe more proselytizing, or just the community from which it emerges is not just strictly a military one; it's more broad. So I don't know. That's kind of what I'm getting out of it, which I think is great. I've learned a lot. And it's not as clean, as simple as people would make it out to be. But I think there was much to be learned in the process. So I know I said a lot, but do you have any maybe final thoughts on what you'd like to tell people who have stuck through this whole conversation, or maybe tuning in here at the end?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit on a lot of what, for me, the appeal is that in this period, you've still got a kind of, it's weird Christianity, right? It's Christianity, but it's still got so much else sort of intermixing with it and influencing it, and it's doing different things and kind of trying to find its feet in different ways. And so you have all these variant practices that are collectively end up at Christianity, but some of them look quite different, and that's, I think, really fun to explore. I think what's also fun for me about thinking through this history is that, as a classicist myself, often you come through and you don't go past the second century. Like after the second century, there be Christianity, and it's sort of the hinterlands of like, yeah, we do classical Latin literature, so we do non-Christian Latin literature, and I, read Virgil or whatever, and we deal with Augustan politics, and it's all very neat. And then in this other box over here is this Christian stuff in late antiquity, and that's different, and they feel very separated that way. And what I find interesting about this history is that it really does. It doesn't stay separate, is that you have to take both of those boxes together. You can't just look at Christianity as that sort of what it becomes later and consider it on that level. You have to take it with all its messiness and all its complication and study it for what it is. And I enjoy getting to sort of tease out it's complicated parts of things.
Yeah, and we've really appreciated having you on for this discussion. I'm hoping this spurs, some additional questions from the community, and hopefully we could have you on again to dive into specific comments or follow-ups. But otherwise, are there any resources or books or other things that you can recommend for those interested? I know obviously we can plug Ask Historians. That's a great resource, but do you have any other recommendations for people looking to learn more?
Yeah, I'll send you some titles, and we can put those in the description. Ask Historians, always a great resource. You can actually find me on there. Yeah. Thanks for having
Awesome.
me on to talk.
Yeah, this was super fun, and I look forward to more. And thanks to all the viewers for sticking it through or jumping to the end here for our final thoughts. See you guys in the next one.